Good. I was supposed to teach a class that focused on the events of Har Sinai, the events in which we narrate what happened when Hashem gave the Jewish people the Torah, and the aftermath, when Moshe Rabbeinu went up the mountain. But I decided to teach a different Gemara tonight for a number of reasons, not the smallest of which, that we find ourselves in a difficult time. It's a time whose difficulties do not seem to be ending nearly as quickly as any of us anticipated or hoped for. We pray to Hashem that there's not going to be a second wave, but in the meantime, the regulations themselves are strangling us and disrupting life, continuing to disrupt life, and there's a lot of negativity. And it's understood. It's not difficult to wrap one's head around why people are negative. So I want to teach you a Gemara tonight. And this Gemara, on the surface, is overwhelmingly negative. It's a negative. It narrates and highlights one of the saddest details during the Second Temple era. It introduces us to a Jew, a young woman who fell so far from her Yiddishkeit that she brought disrepute to her entire priestly clan. She came from a family of Kohanim. And what's remarkable is that for centuries, for millennia, this Gemara was learnt in a certain light. And it wasn't until 1975 or 74, on Vav Tisha, during Aseret Yemei Tshuva, that Rebbe made a Siyum, a completion on a Masechet in honor of his mother's yahrzeit, as he was wont to do. And he said it's Aseret Yemei Tshuva. And it's a time to speak about Bnei Ubenot Yisrael, about the Jewish people, in a positive note. And it may have been in response to certain negative things that were said, people who were making very judgmental statements about the Jewish people. And people talk a lot about the Rebbe's positivity bias. He was like always gravitating towards seeing something in a positive light. And it's true. And I think that this Siyum, this study of the end of Masechet Sukkah, serves as a beautiful illustration of that incredible positivity, that incredible bias to see things in a positive light. In addition, over the last couple of weeks, and even earlier, there's been a tremendous amount of finger-pointing and judgmentalness in the Jewish community in a very unhealthy way. And it's really devolved to the point in which there's not only no love, but no tolerance even for people who have a different opinion, which is not a good thing. I spoke about this a couple of weeks ago. I talked about the idea of the meaning of Ahavat Yisrael. I talked about the notion of if you look at somebody with love, and if you really love them, you'll see things differently. But this was something that we all need to take to heart as we continue to move through these challenging times. We need to resolve to look at others in a positive light and to really work at it. And the third part of what has kind of shifted me is that I was sitting on a Zoom meeting with a group of rabbis from across the city, and we're talking about some very important things which affected the community on multiple levels. And there was one of the members who spoke so terribly about the Jewish people, saying that because people speak or talk in shul, that's why all of this is happening. And my only response was, chas v'shalom, to be mekatrig, to speak in such negative fashion, and to highlight the negativity of Klal Yisrael. So for this and other reasons, we're not going to be studying Masechet Shabbat tonight. We're going to be studying Masechet Sukkah. And in order to appreciate and understand the piece of Gemara that we're going to learn tonight, which is at the end of Masechet Sukkah. It's the tractate has 55 pages, folio pages. And on Daf Nun Vav, it always starts from the second page. That's how Gemaras are printed, from Daf Beis. So on Daf Nun Vav, which proverbially is page 56b, it's actually 55, but 56b, towards the end, the Gemara will explain a statement which was made earlier in the Mishnah. So first I want to share with you the words of the Mishnah, and afterwards we'll go forward to take a look at what the Gemara says. The Mishnah is found on side A of the page, Daf Nun Vav, Amud Aleph. It is the final Mishnah of Masechet Sukkah, and it speaks about the Kohanim. The Kohanim served in the Beit HaMikdash. Now, initially, there wasn't many Kohanim. On the first day of Kahuna, we only had 4 ordinary Kohanim and 1 big Kahuna, Aaron and his 4 sons. And an hour later, there was only Aaron and 2 sons. So Pinchas later joins the Kahuna, and the Kohanim have children, and the families begin to develop. And at a certain point, during the time of King David and Shmuel Hanavi, the Kohanim are divided into 24 watches, 24 mishmarot. And they would constantly change in the Beis HaMikdash. Mishmar in, mishmar out. One watch came in, it served for a week, and then the next watch would come in. And the truth is that not all of the Kohanim would necessarily be active in the Beis HaMikdash for all 7 days of the week. Oftentimes, they were really active only for one of those days, depending on how many Kohanim showed up. Remember, Kohanim lived across the country. They didn't all necessarily live in the holy city of Yerushalayim. And so when their week would come, they would travel from far away, maybe even from outside of Israel. And they would take up temporary residence in Jerusalem, and then they would be in the Beit HaMikdash. And then when they were on duty, they would even sleep in the Beit HaMikdash. When was the changing of the guard? This happened Shabbat midday, at what we call today the Musaf service. After the additional offerings were brought to honor the holiness of Shabbat, subsequent to this, the Lechem Hapanim, the showbread, would be exchanged. 12 showbreads piled high on the sacred gold table that occupied a special space inside what was known as the Kodesh, or the sanctuary, the holy sanctuary. So breads were slid into the table. There was these stacks, and as one bread came in, the other bread would come out, and that's how the stacks were exchanged. 2 stacks of 6 very tall box-like breads, and then those breads would be divided amongst the Kohanim. The high priest would take half, and then the incoming watch would be switching with the outgoing watch. So the afternoon or evening service of Shabbat was performed by a new watch of Kohanim. That was the changing of the guard. And the changing of the guard would hinge on the Lechem Hapanim, on the distribution of this bread that had many, so to speak, faces, this box-like bread with many, many surfaces. And when that bread would be divided, the bread would be eaten by the Kohanim, and then the outgoing family would leave the Beit HaMikdash, and the incoming family would take up their positions. What happened on Yom Tov? What happened in a time like Shavuot, which is coming up? Or on like a holiday of Pesach, which just passed us several weeks ago? Or a holiday of Sukkot, in which all of the Jewish people were commanded, Shalosh pa'amim b'shana, 3 times a year. Everybody is ordained and mandated, if possible, to make the journey to the Beis HaMikdash. So the Mishnah says that on Yom Tov, things were different. And then the Mishnah goes into the details of Yom Tov in proximity to Shabbat. What happened the other days of the year? And this is where I'm going to pick it up. So the Mishnah says, Ubisha'or Yemot Hashana, on the other days of the year, where you had a watch that was coming in and a watch that was going out. So the Mishnah here doesn't seem to speak about the Kohen Gadol taking half the challah. The Mishnah seems here to indicate that simply 6 chalot, 6 of the 12 went to the outgoing group, and 6 of the 12 would go to the incoming group. So the Mishnah says, Hanichnas notel sheish, the incoming group of Kohanim would take 6, v'hayotze notel sheish, and the outgoing group of Kohanim would take 6 chalot. That's what the Mishnah says. The Gemara now continues and gives us another detail, another ruling about the distribution of the lechem hapanim, of that special bread that had many surfaces. The Gemara says, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he says, Hanichnas notel sheva. In his ruling, in his opinion, the incoming would take 7 chalot. V'hayotze notel chamesh, and the ones leaving would only receive 5. And there's numerous reasons for this. The ones coming in, so to speak, need to have, they need to be given more strength, more koyach. They're going to be coming in. They're on top of their game. The other group is kind of leaving. And as such, we move into another detail. After having recorded these two opinions, here the Gemara records something which everybody agreed upon, a distinction made between the group coming in and the group of Kohanim that was leaving. Hanichnosin, says the Mishnah, those who are coming in, cholkin batzafoin, they would divide the spoils. They would divide the special bread amongst the entire group in the north of the Mizbeach. Rashi says, this was Kidei sheyiru hanichnosin shahatzafon iker. So those coming in would be reminded that the north of the Mizbeach was the most important piece of real estate in the entire courtyard, because that's where the korbanot, that's where the offerings would actually be slaughtered. Shaharei, for Rashi says, Kavu hakosov l'shchitas kodshe kodashim. That's where the highest level of animal offerings, that's where the highest level of the service of the Beit HaMikdash would be taking place on the north side. So the north side was the holiest area. This is a group coming in, and it's kind of like a refresher. They aren't actually being told, but they get a sense. Here's where you'll get your special piece of bread when they're coming in. Others maintain that this is also because those who are coming in, well, they get more credit, so to speak. They need the empowerment more. As I said earlier, they're on top of their game. In the words of our rabbis, the way the Rambam puts it in Pirush HaMishnayos, Hanichnosim yoser chashuvim mehayotzim. The ones coming in are given greater prominence. They're given preferential treatment over those who are leaving. And the intention, it seems, is that the person who is prepared to do a mitzvah, or preparing, is poised to engage in holiness, is on a higher level than the one who has now completed the service and leaving. Think about it. One's on the way up, one's on the way down. Even if they're in exactly the same plateau, the direction is very different. They're going into the Beis HaMikdash. And as such, they're given greater prominence, and they're given a greater sense of importance. They receive it on the north. Ha'ilu, but the Mishnah goes on to say, but v'hayotzim, those who are going out, biddarom, they receive the lechem hapanim in the south. The Gemara now tells us something very strange. Of all the mishmarot, there was one mishmar, one watch of Kohanim, who got different kind of treatment. They weren't given the same respect. They weren't afforded the same dignity. Bilga, this mishmar was known as Bilga, la'olam choleket b'darom. They would always receive in the south. On the Shabbat, when they were leaving, they received on the south side of the courtyard. On the Shabbat, when they were entering, they also received on the south side. In other words, they weren't given the same consideration. They weren't dignified in the same fashion as the others were. The Gemara goes on to say, since we're talking about Bilga, and we started with this notion of the Lechem HaPanim, and from there we talked about where the Lechem HaPanim, where the showbread is distributed. And we talked about the distinction between those coming in and those coming out. And then we talked about Bilga. So the Gemara says that because we're talking about Bilga, and Bilga having some of their dignity stripped from them, the Gemara says something else about Bilga. The Tabata and Bilga's ring in the floor of the Azara, Kavua, was essentially locked down. Okay, what does this mean? What is this business when we talk about these rings? So let me give you a little background. The background is that the north area of the Azara, and some of you in this very forum would have joined me for the classes that I gave, and I will continue to give, Bezrat Hashem. Hopefully Mashiach comes before in the 3 weeks when we talk about the Beit HaMikdash. This past year I spoke in great detail about the true north, and I talked about the idea of the rings, and I explained them in detail. And they're available. They're on YouTube, and you can go back and look at the class for more details about this. But here's the short version. In the north side of the Mizbeach, there were 24 rings, if you will. And these rings were installed in the Beis HaMikdash so as to allow the Kohanim to be able to bring the offerings in a more efficacious way. It made things a little easier. So the Mishnah in Midas tells us that in the beginning, the animal had to be held down by the other Kohanim, and then one Kohen would actually slaughter, he would shecht the animal who was going to be a korban, and then the blood was received. Now this is not an easy thing. Even if they're not big bulls, even if they're small sheep or goats, it's not an easy thing to turn an animal upside down and to hold him. It's not simple. So as such, it became uncomfortable. And what the Kohanim started to do was, they'd make a tiny scratch between the eyes, and that would draw some blood, and that would disorient the animal, and then they'd be able to kind of, when he was caught off guard, do what they had to do. Or sometimes they would literally have to wrestle the animal down. Yochanan Kohen Gadol was one of the great Kohanim Gedolim of the second Beit HaMikdash. He was very uncomfortable with this. He said that the bloodletting seemed almost to mimic the notion of a mum, of a blemish. And a blemished animal is not allowed to be brought as a korban. Furthermore, he said, when you wrestle the animal down, the animal might be hurt. And that could cause maybe breakage, perhaps in the ribs, and that could puncture the lungs, and that would render the animal non-kosher, what we call in Hebrew treif, which literally means torn. It's a euphemism to describe what might happen if the lungs or some of the other inner organs would be punctured. So because of this, he installed these rings. And there's a dispute amongst the Rishonim exactly how these rings worked, but it seemed that these rings kind of came out of the floor like this, like a round ring, and there was a little bit of space. So the animal's neck could be slid under, and then the ring would be rotated so it actually would close around the animal. And once it would close around the animal, then it was easier to slaughter the animal. Some say that it was a larger ring and went over the belly of the animal. Some say it was the head of the animal came through. We don't know with absolute certainty how the rings functioned. But we do know, as the Mishnah tells us here, that Bilga, there was 24 rings, and they corresponded to 24 different mishmarot, and every mishmar had its ring. Bilga's ring was essentially tied down. It was locked. So it no longer functioned. They didn't remove the ring, but Bilga couldn't use it. Which meant that the Kohanim, from the watch of Bilga, had an inordinately difficult time to bring the korbanot, to bring the offerings, more so than all of the other Kohanim. So they're given less dignity in the distribution of the lechem hapanim and the showbread on the way into the Beis HaMikdash. And the privilege of making their service a little easier, making their life a little simpler, was also stripped from them, as the Mishnah tells us. It's kind of like binding a book on both sides. You can't open the book. So when they installed the ring fully, you weren't able to utilize the ring. And the Mishnah finishes off by telling us that there was another privilege that was taken from them. And namely, that the different watches of Kohanim each had their own set of chalafim, or chalafot, slaughtering knives. So the Mishnah says that the family of Bilga, Chalona, which literally translates as her window, or her opening, the family's opening, was stuma, was sealed. So the chalon, the window, was a euphemism for the opening of a compartment on either side of the actual structure of the sanctuary. On the front facade, there were these box-like openings. And each one of the families kept their own knives there. And they had to keep their knives in good working order, make sure the knives were clean, make sure the knives were sharp, make sure the knives were unblemished, and that they were able to function properly, as every good shochet does. You got to keep your mechanisms in good working order. So they didn't have the privilege of a chalon. They had to figure out how to put their knives away somewhere else. In other words, something that was done to make life easier for the other Kohanim was not afforded to this family of Bilga. Now you got to be wondering, hey, it's just not fair. What happened to these Bilga people? They're stripped of their dignity. They don't get the special honors. They don't get life made easier for them when it comes to the actual shechita. And we don't even help them prepare or give them a place for storage. They can't put their gear anywhere. Why did all of this happen? The Mishnah doesn't tell us. The Mishnah simply states that. That's what the Mishnah says. On the next page, towards the end of Masechet Sukkah, the Gemara returns to this subject. This is the final piece of Gemara. And the Gemara says, we learned in the Mishnah, Bilga la'olam chaylekes bedarim. Bilga would always receive the lechem apanim on the south side, whether Bilga was entering or leaving, which was different than everybody else, as well as other differences. And that, as we mentioned, the difference of the rings and the difference of the storage area for the chalafim, for the knives. So the Gemara now seeks to explain why it is that Bilga was treated differently. Tanu Rabbanon, our rabbis learned. Now what we're about to learn, this Tanu Rabbanon, it's not a Mishnah, but it comes from the genre of the Mishnayos. It's something which is written in the carousel of the Mishnah, which is known as Tosefta. Tosefta is like the Hebrew word Tosefet, in addition. So there were many, many rules that were included in the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi sifted through thousands of versions, according to one version, of every halacha, and he recorded a very precise and exact syntax for which the Mishnah was comprised. That's the Mishnah was composed of. Now, there were other very important teachings that for one reason or another didn't make it into the body of the Mishnah, but they were preserved in a secondary tome, in a secondary body of writings. And these writings were seen as the codicil or add-on to the Mishnah. In every good Gemara, they're printed in the back of the Gemara, and it's called Tosefta. Now, usually we don't typically open Tosefta and study. The only reason you would want to look in the Tosefta is because you want to compare with what our Mishnah says and the Tosefta says. And you don't have to do this on your own, because very often the Gemara, which is the commentary of the Mishnah, will introduce you to a Tosefta. So Tanya is what's called a Braisa, and Tanu is what's called a Tosefta. So the rabbis learned in the Braisa and the Tosefta, they learned Maisa Miriam Bas Bilga. There was a story that the origin of all this trouble that the family of Bilga had goes back to a narrative, a story of a young woman whose name was Miriam, the daughter of Bilga. Now Rashi says she's not actually the daughter of Bilga. Mimishmar Bilga Hayta. She was from the family of Bilga. Mimishmar Bilga. V'chein Shma. And that was her name. So it seems she was called Miriam Bat Bilga. I'm not sure, but this is probably something like a last name. Some Kohanim, their name is Kahan. Some is Kahanaman. Some is Cohen. Some is Cantor, some is Kaplan. I'm not a Kohen, that's another story. But there are different names. Some is Tawil, Sephardic Jews, Ashkenazic Jews. For a variety of reasons, different names were attributed to different Kohanim. Katz, which is an acronym for Kohen Tzedek. So there were different names. And it's very possible that these families had like the equivalent of what we would call a last name. Maybe everybody was called Bat or Ben Bilga. That was the last name. Or maybe for whatever reason she was known, so they referred to her as Bat Bilga. The Chasdei David on the Tosefta, he says it is impossible to suggest that she was actually the daughter of Bilga. As some would think, so maybe Bilga started the clan and she was the daughter of Bilga. The Chasdei David says it's impossible to say that because Bilga lived in the beginning of the first Beit HaMikdash. We know that because he is mentioned as a family of the Mishmarot, of the watches of Kahuna, in the book of Chronicles, in the book of Divrei Yomim. So Bilga himself lives in the beginning of the first Beit HaMikdash. This young lady lives in the middle of the Second Temple era. As you'll soon see, she shows up in the preamble to what we call today the story of Hanukkah. So Miriam Bat Bilga is from the Mishmar of Bilga. She can't be the daughter of Bilga. She lived centuries after Bilga, but that's what she was called. Chen Shma, that's her name, Rashi says, Miriam Bas Bilga. So the story goes with this Miriam, this young Jewish lady. She was not a very nice girl. She was not a very pious girl. She was not a very loyal or devout Kohenet. In fact, she was a big troublemaker. So much so, Shehemira Data. She abandoned Judaism, she renounced her Jewishness, and she formally embraced a foreign faith system. This is the greatest sin possible. She left her Judaism behind. What you would call today an apostate. She converted out of the faith. Not only did she convert out of the faith, Vaholcha, she went, Venisas Lesardiot. She married a Greek noble person, a member of the Greek nobility. Now, this is very intense because there are some people who intermarry, unfortunately, and they want it to be Jewish. They want the ceremony to be Jewish. They want to be recognized as the Jewishness. They still want to be part of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, there are many, 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 many young Jews in this situation today. So they don't renounce their faith. So I'm Jewish. I fell in love. I'm Jewish. This young lady didn't just fall in love. The Gemara says she renounced her faith. She left Judaism behind. She embraced a foreign faith system. She became a pagan idolater. And after becoming a pagan idolatress, then she went and she married a member of Greek nobility. Now, the word sardiot, which is, an officer or a member, a high-ranking member of Greek society, according to the Yavitz, is actually, the word sardiot is a Hebrew word rather than a Greek word. And it comes from the words sar and hedyot. So sar is a lord, a prince, and hedyot is a commoner. So it's almost like an oxymoron. Are you a lord or you're a commoner? Just by way of illustration, we live in Canada. And Canada fashions itself after the British parliamentary system. We are, after all, part of the British Empire, part of the Commonwealth, as they call it. When you become a citizen, you still swear loyalty to the Queen. She's on our dollar. And she has a chair in our parliament. I saw it, I was there. And when the Prime Minister annually makes his throne speech, which I guess would be the equivalent of an American president delivering the State of the Union address, the chair is there. I don't know if the Queen has ever come to hear the throne speech, but the speech is made by the Prime Minister to the Queen. And she has an empty seat, and they pay homage and bow to it and recognize the Queen's sovereignty, and that's called the House of Lords. The Prime Minister, of course, comes from the House of Commons. For our American viewers, the easiest way I can make this is that you have a Congress, a House of Congress, and the House of Congress is comprised of Congress people and senators. 2 senators per state. Congress people, according to the various, I forget what it's called in the States, we call it ridings here in Canada. So you have your congressional areas, the congressional, and that's the House of Representatives. The House of Senate, the House of Representatives together make the House of Congress. So in Canada, like in Great Britain, there's a parliament, and the Lords are part of the lawmaking body, but the Lords are not elected. The Lords are appointed. And our senators are appointed also. They're not elected. And they don't really have that much power. They kind of ratify law. In Canadian law, things have to go through the House of Lords. So when I was there, I was a guest in the House of Lords. And the interesting thing is I was sitting, and the members of Parliament, many of whom I knew, were all standing. And I saw that they put, there was like a line of scrimmage, and they could only come till a certain point. And I was told, it was explained to me, that a commoner may not sit in the House of Lords unless they're a guest, which I happen to be. And anyway, I wasn't actually in the actual floor, we were on the sides. But in the actual floor, the only ones who are allowed to sit are the justices, the Chief Justice, and members of the Chief Court, the Chief Justices of Canada, and the Lords. The Lords, those are like your senators. So that's the House of Lords. The commoners stand. So we have Lords and commoners. This is like, now this Lords and commoners, this is a hand down from a previous era and from previous civilizations. Now, again, I don't know if this is a Greek word or not. I couldn't get to the bottom of that, but the Yavit says that the word sardiat, it's a Gemara word, it's a Jewish word. It's a word for Lord Commoner, which is an oxymoron. What does that mean? So apparently, according to the Aruch, the Lord Commoner was a person who was appointed to lord over the commoners. So he was a mid-level member of nobility. He wasn't really a member of the House of Lords per se. He would adjudicate disputes, so would be responsible for a group of commoners. And that's why it's called sardiat. Okay, so she married well, but not that well. She didn't marry the emperor or anything. She didn't marry a member of the royal family. She didn't marry a member of the highest ranking nobility. She married a sardiat. She married a high-ranking Greek officer, a member of Greek nobility, and it seems pretty clear that he was a member of the occupying forces that had come under the command of the Greek general. I think his name was Apollonius at the time, or maybe Apollonius was dispatched later. This is all during the rule of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Epimanes, depending on who you asked, who was the sovereign in Athens during the story of Hanukkah. So she abandons her faith, and she marries a non-Jew, a member of the ruling class of the nation that persecuted and tried to destroy the faith of the Jewish people. These are the people the Maccabees fought. These are the people who sought to incinerate the house of Israel. And she married a member of its nobility. So he was a sardiat, echad, mimalchei Yevonim, from the ruling class, from the Caesars, the Greek Caesars. Now, if that's not bad enough, the Gemara tells us it gets worse. Not only did she leave her faith, not only did she intermarry, not only did she embrace a nation that was at war, if not with the material reality of the Jewish people, but certainly with the faith of Israel and the Jewish religion. The Gemara says, "Kishenichnasu Yevonim leheichal," when the Greeks, the Assyrian Greeks, the Seleucids, or Seleucids, when they marched on Jerusalem to quell what they perceived to be rebellion, to stamp out and destroy the Jewish religion, they conquer or occupy the city of Yerushalayim. And then they march on the Beit HaMikdash. And their goal is singular, to turn the Beit HaMikdash into an idolatrous shrine, a temple in which they would worship Zeus and Apollo and another whole plethora of Greek gods and goddesses. So they came into the Heichel. Yeah, this is the story of Hanukkah, where they went and looked for all the oil and tried to make sure that nothing was done in a pure fashion, where they brought swine on the altar. When the Yevanim rode into the Beis HaMikdash with the intent of its spiritual destruction, this Miriam came along with them. And the Gemara says, Hoiso mivaetes bisandolo al gabe hamizbeach. She was slapping, hitting the altar, the mizbeach, with her sandal. She removed her shoe. Incidentally, in the Middle East, in antiquity, the greatest shame is when you would remove your shoe. If you show somebody the bottom of your shoes in large swaths of the Middle East, it is still considered to be an act of denigration. If you remember, when the American forces occupied Baghdad, those who hated Saddam, and many hated him, Yimach Shemo, there was images of a large statue of Saddam being pulled down. And I remember this very clearly. People pulling off their shoes and smacking the effigy of Saddam Hussein, this stone effigy, with their sandals. And there's much to be said about this, but this apparently is not a recent custom in the Arab world, but actually it predates the modern Arab civilization by many, many centuries, in fact by millennia. We're going back. So here we have Miriam, this apostate girl, who abandoned her religion, her faith, a Kohenet no less, a member of the priestly clan. Not only does she marry a member of the nobility, of the enemies of the Jewish people, but she made sure to be in Jerusalem on that fateful day, on that black day, when the Greeks rode into or conquered or captured the Beis HaMikdash, removing its Kohanim and its service, and instead bringing idolatrous pagan customs. The greatest violation, the greatest shaming of what we consider to be sacred and holy. The rape of the Beis HaMikdash, in graphic terms. And so as the Beit HaMikdash is being raped and ravished by our enemies, Miriam, in an act of supreme brazenness, removes her shoe and she begins to smack the mizbeach with her shoe. This is the greatest insult. When you want to insult somebody or something, you hit it with your shoe. That's how it was. And that's how it still is in very many areas of the Middle East. Va'amra, the Mishnah and the Gemara says, she said, Lukus, Lukus. What is Lukus? Lukus, Rashi says, first of all, Kishenichnas Yevanim Lahechel, this is B'yemei Matisyahu ben Yechanan. Yechanan Kohen Gadol we spoke about earlier. This is in the days of Matisyahu. Yes, that's correct. Matisyahu, the father of Yehuda Maccabi, the originator, the father of the rebellion of the Chashmonaim, the architect, if you will, of what later becomes known as the story of Hanukkah. The man who catalyzed the rebellion. So in his days this happened. And she goes and screams, Lukus. And Lukus, Rashi says, Hu ze'ev, this is a wolf, Bilashain Yevani, in Greek. Now, actually, when I read this Rashi, I thought that, I guess the name Lucas must mean wolf. And there is a name wolf, it's a Jewish name. And there are some very famous secular Jews who have the name Wolf. There's a commentator in CNN whose name is Wolf. And it's also a German name. It's a Yiddish name, Wolf, Zev and Wolf, and Wolfie. And it is a common name, actually. And I figured, Lucas must be the name Wolf. But apparently it's not so. When I did a little research, it turns out that Lucas, at least in the way I was able to find, is identified people who came from Lucania in Italy. I don't know. At any rate, I don't know if Lucus is not the same as Lucas, but Lucas, Rashi tells us, means in at least ancient Greek, it means wolf. So she's yelling or screaming at the Mizbeach, wolf, wolf, and she's hitting the Mizbeach with her shoe. And what did she say? Wolf, wolf, she says. Ad mosai atamechala mamoinam shel Yisrael. For how long will you consume the money or the residuals of Israel, of the Jewish people? So you take their offerings, you consume the offering, which costs money. But when they're in trouble, where are you? She's really ashamed. It's attacking God. The Mizbeach becomes, if you will, the effigy for God in her view. She's hitting the Mizbeach and saying, you take all these offerings from the people. Where are you when we need you? Where are you when the Jewish people are being occupied by a foreign power, crushed under their boots? Where are you? When this happened, when she said these brazen words, this caused a seismic aftershock amongst the entire nation of Israel. I want to for a moment talk about the idea of why does she say Lucas, Lucas? What's the business with, why does she call him wolf? So according to the Maharsha, wolves are known to attack the sheep. And the Mizbeach, they used to bring 2 yearling sheep, one in the morning and one in the evening. So that's why she said wolf, because wolves consume sheep. And the emphasis on wolf, according to the Chazon Yecheskel, has a lot to do with the idea that the Beis HaMikdash, or specifically the Mizbeach, was on a peninsula that jutted out from the territory of Binyamin. Now, if this is true, if the Chazon Yecheskel is right, then we're talking here about a very learned young lady. She knew not only about the korbanot, which would be natural. She was from a family of Kohanim, so she knew that there was yearlings, korbanot, the Tomid Shel Shachar, Tomid Shel Bein Harbayim, a morning offering and an afternoon offering. But she even knew that there's this idea that the Beis HaMikdash is situated on land that is an amalgamation of territory from Binyamin, from the tribe of Benjamin, and from Yehuda, from the tribe of Judah, and that the Mizbeach is situated on a peninsula that juts out from the land of Binyamin. And the Binyamin in the verse is called Ba'am Binyamin Ze'ev Yitreif, and according to one interpretation of our sages, which Rashi quotes on the verse that speaks about the blessing of Jacob, calling him a praying wolf, it refers to the Mizbeach. So this is a girl who had an education. She knew what to call the Mizbeach. She knew the history. She understood the symbolism, which makes her sin ever so much worse. She was not an ignorant girl. She was a girl who came from what we would call a princely family of Jews. From the clerisy, from the highest upper cut of the Jewish spiritual fabric, the fabric of Jewish society. And she's a learned girl. She has euphemism in place for the Mizbeach, which is bang on. She knows exactly what she's talking about. And why does she say Lucas, Lucas twice? According to the Ben Ish Chai, in his commentary Ben Yehoyada, he says because she refers not only to the second Beit HaMikdash, she says, where were you last time around? Where were you in the first Beit HaMikdash? You're always there to take. You consume the Jewish money, but you don't protect them in the time of need. This was such an offensive, such a hurtful, such a damning event that must have been seen, witnessed by Kohanim, and by word of mouth. Couldn't be on Facebook Live those days. There wasn't even a newspaper. But by word of mouth, apparently, the word had gotten out to the point that when the story of Hanukkah unfolds, which is many months later, almost a year and a half later. And when the Beis HaMikdash service is reinstated, so Kishashamu Chachamim, when the sages, the Sanhedrin, who were not sitting in session when this happened, they were all in hiding. When the sages heard Bedavar, Kavu estabata, at that point they installed the ring. In other words, it couldn't move anymore. They rendered it non-functionable. Satmu et chalona, they sealed the window. Obviously, this is when the Jewish people are back in the Beis HaMikdash. And clearly, they stripped them of their dignity in distributing the lechem hapan and the showbread. The Gemara says, this is one version, this is one narrative. The Yeshayimrim, there are others who say that there's another reason. Mishmarta Shoy Halavai. This was, the Kohanim always came late. You were supposed to come on Friday before Shabbat, so that you could be all ready and prepped for Shabbat late morning, mid-afternoon. But they didn't do that. Some of them came Friday. Many of them would show up Sunday or Monday. Say, it's nothing to do with Shabbos anyway. It's quiet. It's just a few korbanot. We don't have to show up on time. We can still catch the minyan later on. They'll be able to use us if we show up after the weekend too. And because of this, v'nichnas yeshevav echav imay. So the other, Yeshevav was the other group of Kohanim. That was the Mishmar that preceded Bilga. They had to work together with them. Why did they have to work with them? V'shimish tachtav, because they had to replace them. There was only a few Kohanim from Bilga, so the Mishmar Hayotze, the group of Kohanim that was leaving, had to remain on. Afal pi sheshcheni harashoyim. Oh, sorry, one second. So this is another reason. This is another reason why now we understand that the family of Bilga did not properly respect Beit HaMikdash and didn't appreciate the privileges they had been given. The Gemara now says, the Brisa goes on to say that even though as a rule, Afal pi sheshcheni harashoyim, generally, Loi nistakru, even though by being a neighbor of a wicked person you generally don't gain. In fact, we say the opposite, wicked, woe is to the wicked one, woe is to his neighbor. Here it was a little different. Rashi says, Nichnas Yeshevav Echev, Seder Mishmerais. I skipped the Rashi, let's go back here. Satmon Chalena Shom Mishmeres, so the common parach, the Gemara is going to ask, so what, Miriam did something not nice, the whole clan has to suffer? So the Gemara says that there's another reason, and this is that they would come late. When their Shabbat came, they wouldn't show up. It was clear that they didn't cherish this privilege. It was something they did. They'd show up. They weren't excited about it. Nobody comes late to his own wedding. Come late to somebody else's wedding. Don't come late. Oh, I forgot it was starting already. This is a big deal. You're supposed to show up on time. V'nichnas Yeshevav Echev. Rashi says, say the Mishmar is Bilga Achar Yeshevav. The order, the watch of Bilga came after Yeshevav. Yeshevav Yaitse Bilga Nichnas. When Yeshevav would leave, Bilga would enter. Uchishashah Mishmar is Bilga Lavai. When the watch of Bilga was delinquent, Ikvan Yeshevav. So they held back Yeshevav. B'mashmarte v'loyatze. They didn't leave. Lefika kansua. That's why they were fined. That's why they were stripped of their dignity. You don't appreciate the Beit HaMikdash. You want to enjoy its privileges. And Rashi says, even though usually we say, woe is to the wicked, woe is to their neighbor, we say, Shcheina Yerushalayim loy nistakru, the oy l'roshe oy l'shcheinoi. Says Rashi, Shcheini Bilga nistakru. The Gemara says, pardon me, the neighbors of Bilga, they did benefit. How did they benefit? Very simple. Because who are the neighbors of Bilga? Hainu Yeshevav. Shebilga leilim chalekes bedarim. Because Bilga was always getting the showbread in the south, even when they were the incoming group. And that meant that the outgoing group of Yeshevav was getting in the more prominent area in the north, as we explained at the beginning of our class. Va'afilu b'chnisasei. The Yeshevav lo'olam b'tzafen. Yeshevav is always receiving the more prominent distribution, always receiving in the north, even when it would leave, because Bilga is one coming next. So if Bilga is in the south, Yeshevav is in the north. V'shabasu lahem l'chel kitzafen. It becomes then a virtue for them. Not only they don't suffer for being neighbors of the wicked, they benefit from being neighbors of the wicked. Okay, so the Gemara says, so it is. The Gemara now goes on and says, one second, I'm a little confused here. According to the opinion that says that the watch came late, they were delinquent, they didn't value and appreciate service in the Beis HaMikdash. Now I understand why they would be fined. But Mishmar, the whole Mishmar, the entire watch, because the whole Mishmar came late. They were a Kohen and didn't appreciate the Beis HaMikdash. According to the opinion that says that this is all about Miriam Bat Bilga, it's about one girl, one daughter of Miriam. This Miriam who behaved inappropriately, who disparaged and shamed the Mizbeach and God and the Jewish people. So one bad girl, the whole watch has to suffer. Shehimira Dasa, that she became an apostate and abandoned her faith and instead embraced a foreign faith system. Mishum brate kansina, because of their proverbial daughter, they were all fined? Doesn't seem to be very fair. Amar Abaye says, Kedamri Inchi, this is, if you will, to paraphrase it in euphemism, Shusa, the Yanuka Beshuka. The talk, Shusa comes from the word Lashon Dibur, it's in talk. The talk of a child in the marketplace, where does it come from? Where does it come from? It's Oida Avua, Oida Ema. They either heard it from the father or they heard it from the mother. That's where it comes from. They didn't think of this themselves. If Bilga did this, Miriam Bas Bilga, where did Miriam hear this from? Miriam clearly, either from her father or from her mother, didn't receive a proper education. Something was wrong to begin with. So the Gemara says, okay, I understand what Abaye is saying. The Gemara asks, nonetheless, Mishum Avua ve'ema kansino lekuli mishmara. Because of a father, because of a mother? I mean, this is a family of Kohanim. There could have been thousands of members of this family. Because of one family that didn't value the Beis HaMikdash, everybody received this fine. So here the Gemara says, well, it goes like this. Amar Abaye said, Oile Rasha, Oile Shcheinai. Woe is to the Rasha, woe is to those around him. So if the others didn't protest, and that means that the environment was lax. They're living in a lax environment. And because it was a lax environment, and this kind of dovetails into the other narrative, that they were lax about their kahuna. They didn't appreciate and value the privilege they were given. And it expressed itself in the most extreme form within Miriam. But what expressed itself within Miriam was really underneath the wraps, so to speak, behind the curtains, in some way, in the entire family. And therefore the family was told, if you don't appreciate Beit HaMikdash, you will not be given extra privileges. The Gemara wishes to finish on a positive note, though. So the Gemara says, just as woe is to the wicked, woe is to their neighbor, so too, toiv l'tzadik, tov l'shchenu. It's good for the righteous, and it's good for those who live in proximity to them, their neighbors. Shenemru imru tzadiki toiv, as it says, speak of the tzaddik, it says Yeshayahu Hanavi, for he is good, kifri ma'aloleim yechelu, for the fruit of their endeavors they shall eat. Now it starts off singular, says imru tzaddik ki toiv, not tzaddikim, but it finishes pri ma'aleleihem, which is plural. And from this we learn that if somebody behaves badly, and that's reflective on the group, and that it affects everybody, that when somebody behaves supremely in a beautiful fashion, it also reflects on the group. This is a very sad story. This is a negative story. It's a terrible narrative about a young Jewish woman who fell to the depths of moral and spiritual depravity from our perspective. And there are many famous questions about this. There are questions, a person who abandoned their faith. So, was the issue that she disrespected the Mizbeach? Was that an issue? And interestingly, contemporary Torah teachers and great scholars discuss this. I want to conclude with the words of one Torah scholar who is known for his fiery criticism of Jews that he perceived to be falling short. I want to share the words of a great halachist, an extraordinarily sensitive Torah sage, who took a very middle-of-the-road approach. He was very, very sensitive and patient, non-critical. It's a middle-of-the-road approach, a balanced approach. And I want to conclude by sharing with you the words of the Rebbe. And this, as I said at the outset of tonight's class, really bespeaks the Rebbe's positivity bias. The Satmar Rav, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum, fiery Torah leader of the Satmar Hasidim, renowned for his opposition to secular Zionism. He interprets this Gemara and he asked the question. He says, "What's going on over here?" But the issue is that she smacked him as Mizbeach. She was an apostate. She intermarried. If they're going to demonize the whole clan, if they're going to attack this clan of Kohanim, if they're going to in some way denigrate the entire clan, they should denigrate her because she was Miriam Bat Bilga, because Hemira Dosa, because Nasan L'Sardiyat, not because she hit the Mizbeach. Why is that an issue? So he says, when you sin quietly, it's bad. But when somebody publicly desecrates the name of God, this is even worse. And he says, really, this is about Chilul Hashem, and she is considered to be a spiritual monster, the worst of the worst, a grotesque and horrible example of Judaism gone wrong, and somebody who's cut off forever from her people, necessarily negatively impacted her entire clan, and the Gemara remembers her. The Torah remembers her in infamy. Very critical. Very critically highlights how this deed was actually worse than you imagine it to be. Reb Moshe Feinstein, when he taught this Gemara, he said that even though Hemira Dasa is far worse, clearly, to abandon your faith, that even though intermarriage is far worse, but he says there's a chavivus, there's a special place within, so to speak, Hashem, for kodshim, for that which is designated for a sacred thing. And because of this, he says, because this was a desecration of kodesh, because this was a desecration of what we would call holiness, so therefore, that's why if you're mezalzel, in his words and in Moshe's words, if you're mezalzel bekodshim, if you demean, if you don't treat with respect that which is sacred, he says this is worse even than being an apostate. It's worse even than abandoning Judaism. When the Rebbe spoke about this Gemara, he said that it's a time in which we need to find merit for the Jewish people. The Rebbe asked, before he got to this question, the Rebbe asked another question. Why do you have to mention her name? Why mention her name? You can say there was a young lady from the house of Bilga. We know that the Torah is so careful and never to defame, to demonize, to personalize. Why does she have to be remembered for posterity, for what she did? And then the Rebbe went to this obvious question. The same question that the Yoel answered, said, Moshe, so what's going on? The Rebbe said. The Rebbe said something very interesting. There's a statement that the Rambam, Maimonides, makes in Igeret Teman. The Rambam says there that there's a tradition that Yerovim ben Nevat is the man who is considered to be the archetypal example of the greatest of sinners. In fact, in Pirkei Avot in the Mishnah, we contrast Yerovim ben Nevat with Moshe Rabbeinu. It says Moshe Rabbeinu was meritorious and brought merit to others. And Yerovim was chota v'hechti. He sinned and he made others sin. had to do with the rebellion against the house of David and the 10 tribes who broke off the kingdom of Israel, which was not considered to be such a heinous sin. But the heinous sin was when they built a fake Beit HaMikdash, so that the Jewish people living in the north would no longer go to the Beit HaMikdash. And they built not one golden calf, but 2 golden calves. And Yeravim is said to be the one who single-handedly turned millions of Jews against Judaism, turned them into idolaters. The most infamous Jew of all time. The Rambam says there that Yeravim ben Nevat would be called to task for all of his sins, including the sin of not making an Eruv Tafshilin. An Eruv Tafshilin is a rabbinic mechanism that was put in place in the time of Yeravim, just before him, by the Beth Din of Shlomo HaMelech. And it goes something like this. If Yom Tov is on Friday, and that's followed by a Shabbat, so when are you going to cook the cholent? How are you going to have warm food for Shabbat? You can't leave it on there for 50 hours. It's a 24-hour thing, 26, 27-hour thing. How long could you leave it there for? Most times, cholent is there for approximately 15 hours, 13 hours. How long could you leave a cholent in there for? You get the black crisp if you leave it there for that long. So the thing is that on Yom Tov, one is not allowed to cook for after Yom Tov. On Yom Tov, one is permitted to cook for Yom Tov, but not for the next day, with the assumption that the next day is a Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, or Friday. But if the next day is Shabbat, you actually are allowed to. But the rabbis forbade it. They said if people will cook for the next day, which is Shabbat, they'll end up cooking for the next day, which is a weekday. But you got to make cholent. You got to prepare for Shabbat. So what you need to do is protect the dignity, the honor that's afforded to Shabbat. And we do that by preparing for Shabbat Erev Yom Tov. So if Yom Tov falls Friday, you prepare for Shabbat on Thursday. You set aside a piece of bread. You set aside on Pesach a matzah. You set aside an egg, which is customary to eat on Shabbat morning. You set aside a piece of fish, which is customary to eat on Shabbat. And in that way, you've begun the process before Yom Tov. So you're not denigrating Yom Tov. You're raising Yom Tov. You're showing honor for Yom Tov. And you're honoring the Shabbat on a weekday before Yom Tov comes in. This is a rabbinic thing. It's a rabbinic idea. The Rambam says Yeravim ben Nevat, the man who turned millions of Jews away from Judaism, would be taken to task for not having made an Eruv Tafshilin. Now the Rambam says this like a big chiddush, like it's a big novelty. And the Rebbe said, really, like, why shouldn't he be taken to task? You're taken to task for everything. But the Rambam says that this is a big novelty. The Rebbe said it has to have a source, and the Rebbe suggested the source is right here. The source is here because we are seeing that Miriam Bas Bilga was taken to task not only for Himiru Dasa, not only for being an apostate, not only for turning her back on Judaism, but furthermore, not only for marrying out of the faith, but even for disrespecting the Mizbeach. In other words, there's a price to pay for everything. And then the Rebbe said this. The Rebbe said, imagine what's being taught to us is that even when somebody has cut themselves off the Jewish people, he's still Jewish. Even when somebody has abandoned the Jewish faith, even when somebody wants nothing to do with Judaism, in fact, they not only don't observe Judaism, they necessarily embrace a foreign pagan faith. They're worshiping idols instead of God. And they go and marry out of the faith. You're marrying a member of the cabinet of the prosecuting government, a member of nobility of the nation that seeks to destroy and deracinate the house of Israel, to destroy the Jewish faith. And you ride into the Beis HaMikdash with your husband and his cronies, and you smack the Mizbeach. And the Chachamim said, there's a fine that comes for that too. In other words, what we're really being told here, said the Rebbe, is that no matter where you roam, a Jew can always come home, because even when somebody seems to have literally separated themselves, truncated themselves, chopped themselves off of the Jewish people, from a Jewish perspective, they're still held accountable. And the Rebbe quoted a verse in which the prophet says that I have known you. And God says, because I know you and love you, That's why I hold you accountable. In other words, no matter what happens, Hashem still considers us to be His special children. He rotates the whole story, the whole narrative. He says the Gemara is coming to tell us that regardless of how low a person might fall, Hashem still loves and cares about them and is offended by their actions. And then the Rebbe said the most amazing thing. He said, what did she say? What did she say? She picked up her shoe. She smacked the mizbeach as if to show the greatest of disrespect. What did she say? She said, why don't you protect the Jewish people? And the Rebbe broke down crying. He said, can you imagine? A Jew who has gone so far from Yiddishkeit, but deep down, what bothered her? You consume their residuals, but you don't rescue them. What bothered her? What bothered her in the end was, why aren't you there for Am Yisrael? This is the Jewish woman who abandoned the Jewish people. This is the young lady who brought disrepute to her entire clan. This is the person that the Gemara records and tells you about her as a paradigm of everything that could go wrong. And yet, what is underneath it all? What bothers her? What is she upset about? She's bothered you don't come for the Jewish people. You don't save the Jewish people. The Rebbe said as to the naming, her being named, this actually becomes a commentary on what was going on at the time. We know there was one woman in Mitzrayim. Her name was Shalamet Bat Divri. And she, unfortunately, was forced into a terrible relationship. But she was flirtatious. And the Torah tells us her name only to let us know that she was the only one. The only one. We were a subjugated people, a slave people, but she was just one. This was a time when the Assyrian Greeks came to assimilate the Jewish people. And as the Rambam Maimonides describes it, the first thing they set their sights on was the Jewish girls. And yet, one Kohenet, one girl, only one. Which brings disrepute to her, but tells us about the tenacious devotion and the love and commitment of everybody else. And really the point here is that it's so black, it's so negative. And instead of making the sin worse or finding a reason that this should still be an issue, and why when somebody is found so wanting, why would you even care about something so small? The Rebbe's analysis of it is because Hashem is teaching us how much He loves us. And how even when somebody goes so far away, deep down they're still good. Deep down they still want what's right. That's not only how the Rebbe looked at a person from antiquity. It's not only how the Rebbe saw a page of Gemara, a historical figure who doesn't offend you and me. It's a story in the past that's so far away. But it's how the Rebbe looked at every single Yid and wanted us to look at every Yid that way. You and I cannot pray with the same fervor as the Rebbe did. You and I cannot bless people with the same power as the Rebbe did. You and I do not have the insight into life and Torah that the Rebbe did. But we can love our fellow Yid. And we can choose to look at other people positively. The Rebbe looked at everybody in a positive way and always tried to find a tiny point of light and magnify it. And that's something we need today, perhaps more than ever before. And let me conclude by saying that the first Beit HaMikdash was destroyed for a number of reasons, but the second Beit HaMikdash, we're told, it all boiled down to unnecessary hatred. Just people couldn't stand each other. There was excuses, reasons, but deep down they just couldn't stand each other. And that wanton acrimony and hatred for no reason brought about the loss of the Beit HaMikdash and the Jewish people's exile. But we are told that ahavat chinam, that instead of harboring hate in our heart, but to harbor love in our heart, and to try to find a way, a positive way to look at everybody. is what will restore us back to the third Beis HaMikdash. And I hope and pray that as a result of our efforts, even small efforts, my friends, in this direction, we will merit in Mirza Hashem very speedily, in our time, to greet Mashiach, to return to Eretz Yisrael with him, to meet in the third Beis HaMikdash, and to receive the Torah all over again in an entirely different fashion, in the way it will be when Mashiach comes. B'mheira will be Ameinu, Amen.